On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg. At 84 years old, Hindenburg hoped Hitler could guide the country out of its severe political and economic turmoil. Hitler, leading the National Socialist German Workers' Party, commonly known as the Nazi Party, had gained substantial political traction by then. Despite winning only 33% of the vote in the 1932 Reichstag elections, the Nazis had become one of the most influential parties in Germany. Once in power, Hitler wasted no time dismantling the democratic structure of the Weimar Republic. He swiftly persuaded his cabinet to invoke emergency provisions of the Constitution, which allowed for the suspension of fundamental freedoms, including those of the press, speech, and assembly. To enforce these measures, he relied on various security forces, the Gestapo, the Stormtroopers, and the Schutzstaffel. These groups were responsible for arresting and executing leaders of opposing political parties, including communists, socialists, and liberals. The Reichstag was purged of dissenting voices, and on March 23, 1933, the Enabling Act was pushed through, granting Hitler dictatorial powers. In parallel with consolidating political control, the Nazis began to implement their racial ideology. They believed in the superiority of the Aryan race and portrayed Jews, Roma, and the disabled as threats to racial purity. Jews, comprising about 525,000 individuals, less than 1% of the German population, were the primary targets of Nazi animosity. The Nazis labeled Jews as racially inferior and propagated the false notion that they were responsible for Germany's economic woes and defeat in World War I. By 1933, new laws had begun to force Jews out of public life. They were barred from civil service positions, universities, and legal professions. An April 1933 boycott targeted Jewish businesses, further marginalizing them. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their citizenship, defining them based on their grandparents' religious affiliations rather than their own beliefs or identities. Between 1937 and 1939, anti-Jewish regulations further isolated Jews from society. They were banned from public schools, theaters, cinemas, and vacation resorts, and were restricted to certain city areas. During this period, the Nazis systematically excluded Jews from economic life. Jewish businesses and properties were either seized or sold at a loss. The situation escalated dramatically in November 1938 with Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, a state-sponsored pogrom against Jews in Germany and Austria. This violent event included the destruction of synagogues, Jewish-owned stores, the arrest of Jewish men, vandalism of homes, and numerous murders. While Jews were the main focus of Nazi hatred, other groups were also targeted. The Nazis, supported by eugenicists who promoted racial improvement, pursued policies of involuntary sterilization to reduce the number of individuals deemed genetically inferior. Between 1933 and 1935, 320,000 to 350,000 people with physical or mental disabilities were sterilized. Many Roma, also known as gypsies, and black individuals were also subjected to sterilization and faced restrictions on marriage with Germans. Approximately 500 children of mixed African-German heritage were similarly targeted. Hitler's regime also persecuted political opponents, trade unionists, and others labeled as undesirable. Between 5,000 and 15,000 homosexuals were imprisoned in concentration camps, where mere accusations of homosexuality could lead to arrest and trial under the revised 1935 Criminal Code. Jehovah's Witnesses, numbering at least 25,000, were banned early on because their beliefs prohibited allegiance to the state or military service. They faced confiscation of their property, loss of employment and benefits, and imprisonment or internment in concentration camps. Between 1933 and 1936, thousands of political prisoners were detained in concentration camps, along with several thousand German Roma. The first major wave of arrests of Jews followed Kristallnacht, with around 30,000 Jewish men sent to Dachau and other concentration camps, and several hundred Jewish women to local jails. This period also saw the rounding up of Roma. From 1933 to 1939, approximately half of Germany's Jewish population and over two-thirds of Austrian Jews fled Nazi persecution, emigrating to the United States, Palestine, other parts of Europe, Latin America, and Japanese-occupied Shanghai. Many Jews who remained were either unwilling or unable to leave due to visa restrictions, lack of sponsors, or insufficient funds. Most countries, including the United States, Canada, Britain, and France, were reluctant to accept large numbers of refugees. The outbreak of World War II on September 1, 1939, marked the beginning of a new phase in Nazi atrocities. After swiftly defeating the Polish army, the Nazis began their campaign to eradicate Polish culture and enslave the Polish people, whom they considered subhuman. Initial steps included the mass execution of Polish intellectuals, including university professors, artists, writers, politicians, and priests. Large segments of the Polish population were resettled to make way for German families, while others, including Jews, were imprisoned in concentration camps. The Nazis also abducted up to 50,000 Polish children with Aryan features, sending them to Germany for adoption. Many of these children were later rejected and died in special camps. As the war progressed, Hitler ordered the systematic killing of institutionalized patients deemed incurable. Special medical commissions reviewed patients' cases and decided who would be murdered. Those selected were transferred to institutions where gas chambers were used for executions. Public outcry led to a secret continuation of this euthanasia program, with victims killed by lethal injections and starvation. The euthanasia program provided the template for the mass murder of Jews and Roma decisions to kill, specialized personnel, killing apparatus, and euphemistic language to mask the brutality. In 1940, German forces continued their conquest across Europe, defeating Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. On June 22, 1941, the German army invaded the Soviet Union, reaching the outskirts of Moscow by late November. Meanwhile, Italy, Romania, and Hungary joined the Axis powers, opposing the Allied forces, which included the British Commonwealth, Free France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis intensified their mass murder operations. Jews, political leaders, communists, and Roma were systematically executed by mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen. The most notorious of these killing sites was Babi Yar near Kiev, where approximately 33,000 Jews were murdered over 2 days. This period also saw the extermination of over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. The concentration camp system expanded significantly during the war. The influx of prisoners from all occupied territories led to the establishment of hundreds of new camps. Ghettos, transit camps, and forced labor camps were created to imprison Jews, Roma, and other victims. In occupied Poland, 3 million Jews were confined to around 400 ghettos, where they faced extreme overcrowding, starvation, and disease. Despite the dire conditions, efforts to maintain cultural and religious practices persisted. Ghettos also provided labor for German war efforts, with many laborers dying from exhaustion and maltreatment. Between 1942 and 1944, the Nazis sought to eliminate the ghettos by deporting their inhabitants to extermination camps. The decision to implement the final solution was formalized at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. Jews from Western Europe were also sent to these killing centers in the east. The 6 primary extermination camps were located at Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. Chelmno was the first to use gas vans for mass executions, killing at least 152,000 individuals between December 1941 and March 1943. Belzec, operating from May 1942 to August 1943, saw the murder of around 600,000 people. Sobibor, open from May 1942 to October 1943, witnessed approximately 250,000 deaths. Treblinka, which began operations in July 1942 and closed in November 1943 following a prisoner revolt, saw the death of at least 750,000 individuals. Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka primarily targeted Jews, with a few Roma, Poles and Soviet POWs among the victims. Few survived these camps, where most were murdered upon arrival. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest killing center, also functioned as a concentration and labor camp. It became the site of the highest number of Jewish deaths, with over 1 million people killed, 90% of whom were Jews. Roma, Soviet POWs, and sick prisoners from various nationalities also perished there. Between May and July 1944, nearly 440,000 Jews were deported from Hungary to Auschwitz, marking one of the largest single mass deportations of the Holocaust. Majdanek, which also served as a concentration camp, saw between 170,000 and 235,000 deaths from gas chambers, starvation and disease. The extermination methods were consistent across the camps. Victims arrived by train, were separated by gender, and forced to undress before being led into gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. They were killed using either carbon monoxide or Zyklon B. Survivors selected for labor faced extreme conditions, including malnutrition, exposure, and brutal treatment. The genocide was facilitated by local collaborators and enabled by widespread indifference or acquiescence. Despite this, there were notable instances of resistance. The Danish resistance, supported by the local population, successfully rescued almost the entire Jewish community in Denmark by smuggling them to Sweden. Other individuals, such as Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, played significant roles in rescuing Hungarian Jews in 1944. Resistance was also present in many concentration camps and ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April and May 1943, though ultimately unsuccessful, was a courageous stand against overwhelming German forces. Although resistance groups primarily focused on defeating the Nazis, there were instances of cooperation with Jewish partisans to save lives. For example, in April 1943, Belgian resistance members assisted Jewish deportees escaping from a train bound for Auschwitz. The US government, like its British counterparts, prioritized winning the war over rescue efforts. Security concerns and anti-Semitism influenced US policies, leading to stringent visa restrictions. In January 1944, President Roosevelt established the War Refugee Board to facilitate refugee rescue, and Fort Ontario in New York served as a haven for refugees from Allied liberated territories. As the war drew to a close and Allied forces neared German borders, the SS evacuated concentration camps, attempting to hide evidence of genocide and relocating prisoners to Germany. Many died during the death marches, forced evacuations on foot. In the final days of the war, conditions in remaining camps deteriorated drastically. Bergen-Belsen, not originally designed for extermination, became a death trap, claiming thousands of lives, including Anne Frank. By May 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, the SS fled and the camps were liberated, ending one of the darkest chapters in human history.